This is a film about adventures whilst rafting down the remote Hulahula River through Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Getting to Fairbanks, Alaska, which was the starting point for the rafting trip down the Hulahula River, took 17 hours and 3 flights. Fortunately, we had clear weather and so were afforded excellent views of the large Pacific Northwest volcanoes and the coastal range with its mountains covered by glaciers. It's always impressive to pass by another jetliner with a combined closing speed of some 1,700 kilometers per hour. Coming into land at Fairbanks under the midnight sun, we flew over the Tanana River, which is a 940 kilometer long tributary of the mighty Yukon River. An area at the Fairbanks Airport is home to an amazing boneyard of aircraft, mainly from the 50s and 60s. The most interesting aircraft in the boneyard was the C-119 flying boxcar with the jet pod on top. These planes were used for forest firefighting. Sadly, there was a 1968 Ford Mustang rotting away in front of a 1957 Douglas DC-6 aircraft. There was an interesting graveyard of former U.S. Army flying banana helicopters. Everett Air has a boneyard of DC-6s to supply spares for their in-service DC-6s. An Everett DC-6 fuel tanker that was manufactured in 1957 was preparing to take off. The DC-6 airless flammable and hazardous materials throughout Alaska. As a bulk fuel tanker, a DC-6 can carry up to 5,000 gallons. DC-6 served as President Harry S. Truman's personal aircraft when he was in office in the 40s and 50s. Passengers from Alaskan cruise ships filled the Discovery 3 stern-wheel riverboat on the Chena River. At the start of their riverboat trip, the passengers got to see a float plane taking off on the Chena River. The Discovery 3 riverboat was built in Washington State in 1987. After being barged north to Alaska, it traveled 1,600 kilometers up the Yukon River to Fairbanks. The riverboat's wake was surprisingly big when it hit the shoreline. The valley of the Goldstream Creek just north of Fairbanks has been almost continuously mined since 1903. The tailings are processed for gravel, which makes for interesting viewing for those who enjoy seeing heavy equipment in operation. Nearby is the historic Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, which snakes almost 1,300 kilometers across Alaska. There is a mixture of nature and abandoned equipment in the area, including the impressive Laterno's snow train from the 1950s. Alaska Freight Lines of Seattle used the snow train to deliver 500 tons of equipment to the Dew Line radar stations being built in northern Alaska. Speaking of northern Alaska, on the way to Eielson Air Force Base, I passed through North Pole, Alaska, which is surprisingly located south of Fairbanks. I was lucky that when I stopped by Eielson Air Force Base, Red Flag Alaska was in progress on the huge Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. This 2-week multinational exercise is meant to provide realistic combat experience to pilots. Because of Red Flag Alaska, I was able to see Japanese aerial refueling tankers and a wide variety of US Air Force aircraft that were based in the United States, Japan, and South Korea. The A-10 close support aircraft of the 25th Fighter Squadron based in Osan Air Force Base, South Korea were impressive as they took off whilst I listened to the car radio.
Yard and property of those pesky mosquitoes with their child and pet friendly treatment, and it's 100% guaranteed. Go mosquito free. Take back your summer for only $60.
The arrival of a giant C-17 from Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York State was a pleasant surprise. The F-16 fighters, painted in non-US style camouflage patterns, belong to the 18th Aggressor Squadron. This squadron uses flying styles and abilities of foreign air forces in order to train United States Air Force pilots against realistic opposition. The number of F-16 fighter aircraft taxiing to the marshalling area at the south end of the runway prior to takeoff was impressive. The F-16s taxied past aerial tankers of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force that were participating in Red Flag Alaska. Finally, the F-16 started taking off one after the other on afterburner. After an hour and a half, the A-10 started returning to base and landing. The A-10 was built around a massive 30mm 7-barrel Gatling gun that can fire nearly 70 rounds a second. Even though I was watching the activity on the base from a public highway, an air policeman pulled up and asked me to leave, so I returned to Fairbanks. Fairbanks, on the banks of the Chena River, was founded in 1901. It has a population of 33,000 people, making it the second largest city in Alaska after Anchorage. Unfortunately, the smoke from nearby forest fires drifted into Fairbanks, reddening the sky and making it slightly unpleasant to breathe. Downtown Fairbanks is a blend of old and new, with historic buildings dating back to the gold rush days. In the depth of the northern winter, the Yukon Quest, a 1,000-mile international dog sled race, is run between Fairbanks, Alaska, and Whitehorse in the Yukon. To descend the Hulahula River, we first flew from Fairbanks to the primitive Grassers airstrip near the head of the Hulahula, where we started our descent down in rafts until just before the Arctic Ocean, where we were picked up and flew to Kaktovik and hence back to Fairbanks for our flights home. The east ramp of the Fairbanks Airport was a hive of activity for small planes coming and going. Soon our bush plane was loaded up and we were leaving. Flying over the Goldstream Creek area, we got an aerial view of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the huge gold dredge number 8 that was operated by the Fairbanks Exploration Company from 1928 to 1959. Soon the forest fires around Fairbanks came into view and we could smell their smoke in the plain. Our Helio Courier was slower than the other one, so soon we were passed despite our head start. As we flew north, we could see firsthand the widespread nature of the forest fires. In fact, Alaska was experiencing its 5th busiest forest fire season in the last 2 decades. Some believe that climate change is making the annual forest fire season longer and more intense in Alaska. We flew across the 3,200-kilometer long Yukon River, which gained notoriety as one of the principal means of transportation during the Klondike Gold Rush at the turn of the 20th century. We flew over Arctic Village, which only has a population of about 150, and then encountered the impressive Brooks Range of mountains, which stretches for some 1,100 kilometers. These mountains give rise to many rivers, including the Hulahula. The meandering East Fork Chandler River flows through a glaciated valley, creating peculiarly shaped oxbow lakes. The Hulahula River's name evokes images of the warm tropic isle of Hawaii, so it's a seemingly strange name for use in such a cold place as the Alaskan Arctic. In fact, the name originated from the whalers of Hawaiian origin who were pressed into Arctic whaling service by the British before the turn of the last century. Of course, the word hula itself refers to a Hawaiian dance. There were 2 planes on the ground when we arrived at Grassers Airstrip. After a quick offloading, the planes are soon gone, enhancing our sense of isolation in the wilderness. From Grasser's airstrip, the Hulahula River flows 113 kilometers almost due north through the Romanzov Mountains of the Brook Range and exits and flows out onto the coastal plain into the Beaufort Sea. On the coastal plain, the river spreads out into multiple braided channels, so route finding becomes the primary challenge. We took out our raft at a primitive landing strip several kilometers upstream of the river's mouth and flew back to Fairbanks via Kaktovik. Our multi-passenger inflatable rafts were large and weighed about 150 kilos, but could carry about 1,250 kilos. Each of our 2 rafts carried 5 people and a mountain of cargo. Pack rafts weigh less than 3 kilos. Compared to our much larger multi-passenger inflatable rafts, the pack raft's smaller size and shallower draft made them ideal for the low water conditions on much of the Hulahula River. However, they couldn't carry the amount of cooking and camping equipment and food that makes for a more enjoyable experience. Near the campsite was a pingo, which is a large mound of earth formed in a permafrost environment when ground ice develops during the winter months and pushes up the surface. The hike to the Pingo was interesting due to the wide variety of flowers, birds, and insects found along the caribou track. This Pingo had collapsed when its subsurface water lens leaked out, leaving behind a water-filled crater that was enjoyed by various waterfowl. From atop the Pingo, there was a good view south out over the Hulahula Valley. During our stay at campsite number 1, 4 different airplanes came and went, some a couple of times. Of these 4 planes, the highlight was the classic de Havilland in Canada DHC-2 Beaver that was built in 1958. The Beaver is perfectly suited for the Alaska bush environment. The airplane boasts a design that allows for short takeoff and landings, as well as versatility when carrying passengers or cargo or both. Despite the fact that production ceased in 1967, hundreds of Beavers are still flying, many of them heavily modified to adapt to changes in technology and needs.
You gonna get shot?
I'll see, eventually.
de Havilland Beaver was named one of the top 10 Canadian engineering achievements of the 20th century by the Canadian Engineering Centennial Board. The 24 hours of sunlight at this time of year was a blessing. After being stuck at camp for a day, it was a welcome relief to finally get out on the mighty Hulahula River, although events would soon reveal that this river was not that mighty for much of the time. After half an hour, the rafts were heavily loaded with equipment, supplies, and people, such that they would require at least half a meter of water to float freely. We left camp with high hopes of a lazy float downriver. Unfortunately, the water level was low, so before long we were scraping bottom and regularly getting stuck. Once the raft was grounded, if pushing with paddles didn't free it, we tried bouncing up and down, and finally, if still stuck, one would have to disembark and push the raft free. The daily river level varied dramatically depending on the rainfall in the surrounding mountains. At times we were not so much rafting as we were walking downriver to avoid the raft getting stuck. Whilst getting back onto the raft after freeing our stuck raft, I slipped and my main camera went into the water, which afterwards ceased to function. However, once back home I put my camera in a bag of rice and surprise, surprise, it started working again, although it's probably worse for wear. At campsite number 2, we were lucky that for a few hours the sun was out and I could dry my river-soaked clothes and tried to dry out my camera. The former dried nicely, while the latter never did until I put it in a bag of rice once I got home. At this time of year, this is the land of the midnight sun, and so the sun never set. Hence there was sufficient light throughout the day that a flashlight was never needed. Unfortunately, the Dall sheep were high up on a distant mountain, making detailed observation impossible, although we could clearly see that there were newborn sheep with their mother on the steep rocky slope. During the short Arctic summer, pollinators were very active. Surprisingly, many of these pollinators were flies rather than bees. We hiked up the large hill behind our campsite to see out over the Hulahula River Valley. From the hilltop, we could see our campsite far below us on the riverbank. The hill was covered with a wide variety of flora. However, it is a challenge to correctly identify all the flora seen, so errors are inevitable. The trip from campsite number 2 to 3 was a cold and damp one, with rain falling up in the mountains and a wind blowing down the valley. Again, the water wasn't deep enough to prevent the rafts from getting hung up. The wind was so strong that we emptied out and used one of the rafts as a windshield at our lunch site. We floated past the campsite of another raft group that we'd briefly see several times before we reached the Arctic coastal plain. We set up riverside at Camp 3 despite the days of rain and the fact that we could see the river level slowly rising. The question was how much rain had fallen in the upper drainage of the Hulahula River. At 3 a.m. the question was answered as the river was lapping at our campsite and still rising. Fortunately, there was a 15-meter rise beside our camp, but it was now separated from our camp by the rising water, so we had to use one of the rafts to ferry erected tents, gear, and people across to it. We then dragged the assembled tents up the hill and humped our gear up to where everything was high above the water level of the river. The new campsite had a very good view out over the Hulahula River. After an hour at 4 a.m. we were finished and our campsite was now at the top of the hill, far above the river. In the morning, after a short sleep, the situation had radically changed again as the river level had dropped and the ferry raft was even stuck in the mud. The clouds cleared, revealing Mount Chamberlain across the river. It was previously believed to be the highest peak in the Brooks Range, but it is now known to be only the third highest peak in that range. After breakfast, we hiked up the high hill behind our campsite to get a good view out over the Hulahula. At an area of slope failure, the exposed cross-section of Arctic soil revealed its structure of an active layer overlaying permafrost. The porcupine caribou is a subspecies of caribou found in Alaska and the adjacent parts of Canada. They are migratory, moving 400 kilometers from their wintering grounds in the southern portion of the range to their calving grounds on the Arctic coastal plain. It was amazing to see and experience how frequently and rapidly the weather changes from miserable rainy conditions to beautiful sunny ways. Carefully looking on the ground, one could see butterflies and tracks that led one to interesting animals such as the shaggy muskox. The shaggy muskox looked like it just stepped out of the cave art drawing of it that was made 30,000 years ago. Muskox have inhabited the Arctic for millennia. Their long shaggy hair is well adapted to the frigid climate. The outer hairs or guard hairs cover a second shorter undercoat that provides additional insulation in the winter. This undercoat falls out when the temperatures climb at winter's end. The muskox's remaining outer shaggy hair helps protect it against the swarms of flies and mosquitoes that torment animals in the summertime. By 1900, muskox were extirpated from Alaska's North Slope due to hunting. They were reintroduced to the area in 1969, and they are the only large mammal that lives year-round on ANWR's coastal plain. The caribou grazing across the river was undergoing its annual post-winter molt, whereby its long coat of both guard hairs and undercoat is shed in great patches. When threatened, muskox run together to form a circle with their young in the middle and their sharp horns facing towards the outside. This technique often is effective against predators, except for those with rifles. The muskox finally stopped eating and turned his attention to me. He started walking towards me and then made a short charge towards me, so I quickly beat a hasty retreat to put some broken ground between him and me. Having established his territorial dominance, he upped sticks and left for greener pastures. That night, the day was capped off by a 100-kilometer-per-hour wind that threatened to flatten my tent until I turned it into the wind. Leaving campsite number 3, we soon reached the entrance to the main canyon section where the Kikiktak Mountain on river left pinches the river into a narrow gorge a couple of 100 feet deep. The next few kilometers contains the best whitewater of the trip, with about a dozen Class 3 to Class 3 plus rapids. They are headwall rapids, where the current slams into the bedrock wall, making for exciting times on the raft. At lunch it was clear that the river was swollen due to the preceding day's rain upstream, but the river now seemed to have mellowed out as we were past the stretch of rapids. However, within minutes after launching from the lunch site, we learned that one should never let one's guard down on a fast-moving river. Immediately after lunch, we became dangerously hung up on a submerged boulder in the main channel. As we were broadside to the strong current, the danger was that the side of the raft would fold underneath the raft, and we'd immediately capsize, losing much equipment and supplies, whilst being swept downstream in very cold water.
We're in trouble. We're gonna flood here in a second.
After what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only 8 minutes, we were freed from the hang-up and back floating along downstream to campsite number 4 at the foot of Kikak Mountain. Campsite number 4 was near a hunt camp that was surrounded by a field of detritus consisting of discarded camping and hunting supplies. This garbage patch in the heart of the wildlife refuge was disappointing. As we were now out of the mountains, the mosquitoes started to become a major bother. Several of us hiked up to the top of the hill behind our campsite, from which we had an interesting view out over the Hulahula River, the small lake atop the far bank, and an excellent view of our campsite and the hunt camp. We headed downriver to campsite number 5 under a beautiful blue sky that was a pleasant change from the cold and rain in the mountains that we had just left behind. Whilst rafting, we came across a muskox walking in the distance. We debated amongst ourselves whether this muskox was in fact the same one that we had seen days earlier. Certainly, given the distance involved and the pace of the muskox, this was a realistic possibility. We headed out at campsite number 5, where we were enthusiastically greeted by a swarm of mosquitoes that stayed on throughout our stay, making for some unpleasantness. The cloud of mosquitoes at the camp meant that it was a challenge to minimize the number of mosquitoes entering the tent when getting into it. Once in the tent, 5 minutes was required to destroy any invading mosquitoes. At dusk, we were lucky to see a lone gray wolf in the distance across the river. The caribou, mainly calves, are the main prey of the wolf in the wildlife refuge. Meals were a daily highlight, but the mosquitoes put a damper on their enjoyment. We hiked up the long hill behind our campsite and gained some beautiful views out over the country, including seeing exactly where our campsite fit into the landscape. The hill harbored beautiful flowers, but the swarms of mosquitoes were enough to drive one to distraction. If it wasn't for DEET, it would have been hellacious. On this leg of our trip, we entered the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, about which there has been an ongoing political debate since 1977 about allowing oil and gas exploration. Supporters of the resource exploration argue that advancements in technology allow for energy production to occur safely and with minimal environmental impact, while opponents argue that drilling is a risky endeavor that would cause widespread and permanent damage to the coastal plain, destroy the area's natural beauty, and jeopardize its wildlife and ecosystems. The 1002 area is the Arctic coastal plain, which comprises 6,100 square kilometers of ANWR's 78,000 square kilometer total area. Surprisingly, we came across a grizzly bear bathing in the river, and he was just as surprised to see us, so he immediately ran away, giving us only a short view.
There's a whole big snowbank along there.
From the top of the hill at our lunch site, there was an excellent view of the Brooks Range of mountains in the distance. We reached the fascinating area of off-ice on the Hulahula River. Off-ice, translated from the German as ice on top, is found along the rivers of Alaska's Arctic regions. It is a sheet of ice that forms during the winter, filling a river valley until the summer months. By spring, there could be as much as 3 meters of ice that is spread out along the sides of the river, into the shrubs, and across the tundra. Off-ice can pose a danger to people on the river since their boat can enter a channel that apparently goes through the ice but actually ends up in a dead end, with the river current pushing them against the ice and perhaps under it as well. In addition, off-ice can collapse, instantly damming up the river, and when that dam finally releases, a catastrophic flood can occur downstream of the off-ice, causing flash floods in any camps downstream. Moving downstream, we could look back and see a pair of caribou in the distance walking on the off-ice, which allowed them to temporarily escape the swarms of mosquitoes on the tundra. As we were well into the Arctic plain, our lunch site had minimal vegetation. Camp number 6 was on the Hulahula's gravel floodplain with not a tree in sight, but lots of mosquitoes swarming over us. This campsite had a good panoramic view of the Brooks Range in the distance. We hiked out onto the pancake flat Arctic coastal plain behind our camp. The grass-covered plain was waterlogged, making rubber boots essential footwear and also making for excellent mosquito breeding grounds. Although we saw caribou trails across the plain, there were no caribou sighted. Mosquitoes, jokingly called Alaska's state bird, form huge swarms that torment anything that moves on the Arctic plain, making life a living hell. In fact, a caribou can lose about 2 kilos of blood to mosquitoes each year. Hence, when mosquitoes attack caribou en masse, they run to snowy or icy areas or windy ridges to escape the onslaught. However, the more time they spend fleeing the swarming insects, the less time they spend eating, which is detrimental to their survival. We could see herds of caribou coming towards our campsite on the opposite bank of the river, and at midnight, these herds started passing by our campsite and crossing the river to get to the mountains and away from the clouds of mosquitoes.
The whole herd is going to cross the river here.
The river proved no obstacle to the caribous, as they are amazing swimmers thanks to their buoyant hollow hair and wide hooves. Adults are known to swim as fast as 10 kilometers per hour, but even newly born calves had no problem crossing the river. The small herds that we were watching pass by are part of the much larger Porcupine caribou herd, which is a migratory caribou herd named after the major river in their range, namely the Porcupine River. They migrate over 2,400 kilometers a year between their winter range and the calving grounds, which are mainly in the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is the largest land migration route of any land mammal on Earth. The scenes of the herds heading off towards the distant mountains was very beautiful. Hopefully, the caribou found relief from the clouds of mosquitoes in the mountains. And in fact, when we later flew back to Fairbanks, we flew over a herd of caribou in a snowfield high up in the mountains, away from the torment of the mosquitoes in the Arctic plain. Overnight, a total of 8 herds passed by our camp, but in the morning they were long gone, with only a few stragglers left to wander by. The lone caribou silhouetted against the golden sky was very pretty. Our final leg on the raft would take us to Camp 7, where we would meet with the bush plane that would start us on our trip back to Fairbanks. After breakfast, as we were packing up to leave, a strong headwind sprang up along the river valley, which made rafting against it pointless, so we waited it out for many hours as our tents flapped wildly in the wind. After several hours, the wind abated, but a fog rolled in. However, despite the fog, we had to push on to the final campsite in order to ensure that we would be in a position to meet the airplane for the transfer to Kaktovik. The Arctic coastal plain area around campsite number 7 was alive with birds, insects, and even the occasional caribou, which made waiting for the plane to Kaktovik interesting. To get back to Fairbanks, we took 2 flights. The first one to Kaktovik in a small helio courier that could land on the primitive grass airstrip, followed by a second one from Kaktovik to Fairbanks in a larger Grand Caravan plane. We were all packed up and waiting when the helio courier made its first landing on the primitive grass airstrip. The mosquito load in the area was impressive, and we even managed to take a swarm with us in the airplane. The plane was a little overweight, and so we staggered into the air. Near the Hulahula River, we flew over polygonal soil patterns typical of Arctic tundra. It was only a 10-minute flight from our campsite to the Kaktovik airstrip, where we offloaded our equipment and waited for the Grand Caravan plane for the flight back to Fairbanks. Our Grand Caravan plane arrived promptly, and we quickly loaded it up, and were soon taxiing out to the airstrip for takeoff. Kaktovik is the site of a long-range radar belonging to the North Warning System that is part of the Atmospheric Air Defense of North America. The site's radome is visible for miles across the flat coastal plain. The caribou that were wandering on the airstrip were both unexpected and a potential accident waiting to happen. Surprisingly, a caribou ran across the airstrip as we were approaching takeoff speed. This was the closest call that I've experienced at takeoff. We flew back through the Brooks Range following the Hulahula Valley, during which time we passed over a herd of caribou that were standing on a snowfield high up in the mountains to escape the torment of the mosquitoes on the Arctic coastal plain. We arrived back to Fairbanks that was covered in the pall of smoke from nearby forest fires. Fortunately, it wasn't long until my flight left, marking the start of a long journey back home from an interesting trip to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.